As we begin tonight, I want to mention something that's been a common theme that the Lord has been reminding each of the Bible studies in the past week. And that is this concept that I want you to understand as we get into a very important subject tonight regarding the significance of the scourging that Jesus took. The scars and stripes, if you will, I like to call them. The scars and stripes that Jesus bore for us. And that is this concept here. Anything pertaining to Jesus Christ, whether it is His nature, whether it's His character, whether it's something He's provided for us, whether it's something He taught, whether it's something He emphasized in the Word. Whenever we read it, whenever we hear it, we instantly have two choices. Whether you realize or not, you have two choices. I'm talking about if you go receive it. You obviously can reject it. I'm not talking about that option. I'm talking about you have two choices. Number one is you can receive it as theological doctrine and put it on a shelf. Or two, you can experience it. One of the two. The Bible repeatedly uses the word know, K-N-O-W. And you got to pay attention to which know or which knowledge is referring to. Because there's gnosis, which is basic doctrinal knowledge, which debates come from. Just like a political debate, likewise you have theological debates. That comes from gnosis. But Paul says, I pray that you know Him. And that is epignosis. And that is an experiential contact knowledge. So when you have knowledge theologically of a subject, and people want to debate it, and yet that same topic you have epignosis, you've experienced it for yourself, there is no debate. Nobody's going to convince you otherwise. You know, whether it's salvation, whether it's healing, whether it's faith, whatever it is. Once you've experienced it for yourself, there's no need to debate it because God's already shown it to you and He's already made that word alive inside of you. So keep that in mind as we begin tonight. It's just been a common theme that's been popping up in every Bible study and even on church this past Sunday for the last week, if you will. We are segueing into the scourging. Now, why is Jesus being scourged? You recall that we studied that when He goes before Pilate the first time and then again the second time, the first time they go before Him, Pilate immediately says, and he authorizes them, if you will, he says, why don't you take him back to your court and you judge him? Which would have meant stoning. And then they reply in Matthew chapter 27 that they said, no, because we cannot order a Roman crucifixion. Well, Pilate kept insisting, I find no fault in him, so I can't see how I can order a crucifixion, but let me just scourge him and let him go, because normally you would do one or the other. And even though the Roman scourging was horrible, it was still the lesser of two evils, the worst being a Roman crucifixion, as we will see in the next session, how horrible a Roman crucifixion really was. But they kept backing him into a corner because plan A was to have Jesus crucified and publicly humiliated. Plan B was, Pilate, if you so much as back down on this, we're going to go tell Caesar. And we're going to tell him that you let a king run loose and a threat to Caesar's throne and see how Caesar likes it. Well, Pilate is now backed into a corner and he's offering to scourge him. They're hollering, crucify him. He washes his hands of the matter and basically says, I want nothing to do with it, but I authorize you to do what you want to do. And when they were given that option, then they said, okay, we're going to go with what you suggested, scourging, and we're going to go with what we suggested, crucify. And that's why Jesus was the only man that we know of recorded in human history to be both scourged and crucified. And he did it for us because it was all according to the plan. Now, who was it that was crying out to have him crucified? It was the religious leaders. These religious leaders, as we noted in Matthew 27, verse 25, the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children." And we talked about they had no idea what they were saying. Now, you can take it from the standpoint, as we did last week, that they're crying out, "His blood be on us and upon our children," the third and fourth generation, as we see in Exodus 20. But what people don't understand, even in having nothing to do with blood, so to speak, even when it comes to normal decision making, we as leaders in the body of Christ need to understand our decisions have significant consequences if they're wrong, and they have significant value if they're right. And even in James chapter 3, I think it's verse 1, it says, we will face a stricter judgment. And you would think these religious leaders, because they studied their history so well, you would think that they would remember what happened early in their history in 1 Samuel 8, when they were crying out for a king just so they can be like everybody else. We want to have a king just like all the other nations. God says, "I want to be your king." They said, "No, we want a king who's occupying the palace, sitting on a throne, making decisions." God says, "You don't know what you're asking, because he's going to send your children off, your boys off to war. He's going to put your girls to work, making them perfumers and bakers. He's going to take at least a tenth of your cattle and livestock. He's going to take your best hired hands. He's going to oppress you, and he's going to tax you. He's going to tax you, that is." And they said, "We still want one. We still want to be like everybody else." And in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 18, here's the response that God spoke. He says, and told through Samuel, "Then you will cry out in that day when you realize you made a mistake, because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves." He says, "But the Lord will not answer you in that day." He won't answer you because you made such a consequential decision. Now, if that was the case back in that decision, can you imagine when they said, "Let his blood be on our hands"? Oh my goodness, what a curse they were placing on they themselves and their innocent kids and their innocent grandkids who may not even have been born yet. That's how religious hate, that's how a desire to be and do what we want can prevail over what God wants. And you see it ends up with Jesus being scourged and crucified. We want our will. You suggest a scourging, we'll take you up on it. But we want our will be done, crucified. Well, that's what happens. And we talked about the fact that a Roman scourging was much different than a Jewish whooping. They took it to the next level. And the mere threat of a scourging could calm a crowd. It could disperse a riot like nothing else. It would cause even the baddest or fiercest criminal, if you will, to give in and say, "Okay, I surrender." All they had to do was pull out the scourge. The flagello. Now, this right here is a miniature version of it. A miniature version of a Roman scourge. Just a small example of what the big one looked like. I don't know what scale this is, whether it's a 1/2 scale or 1/3 scale or 1/4 scale. But even this right here, I wouldn't want to be beaten with it. Especially when you figure what all this is going to be laced with. We noted that a victim would be tied to a granite post about 2 feet high. They would be fixed there where they couldn't move. Well, they could twist a little bit, but they couldn't dodge the lashes. It is told, and I've seen pictures of it, both on television live footage, as well as stuff you can see on the internet. Go and look it up. There is a granite post still there in the land that they claim is the post that Jesus was tied to. And it is a granite post that you can still see the marks where they missed a body and hit the post. And it's in the post where it's got the dents in it. That's something. That's how powerful this right here was. It was considered to be the most feared and deadly weapon of that day. We noted that Roman citizens were exempt, as well as women. But the key phrase we mentioned at the close of last week is that as one of these things hit you, and then they jerked it back, it would leave ribbons of skin hanging. Keep that in mind. A victim was first stripped naked so that his entire flesh was open and uncovered, fair game, and it was exposed for beating. The victim's hands were tied over his head to that 2-foot high granite scourging post. His wrists were secured in some metal rings to restrict the body from movement. In that locked position, they could not wiggle or move to avoid the lashes. They might could turn to the side, or they might could turn to the side. And when they did, if you turn to this side, okay, well, the lash coming from here would wrap around. You turn to this side, when the lash came from here, it would snatch. It would come. They didn't care whether it was the soldier's shoulders. They didn't care whether it was the back of the legs. Romans got a kick out of it. They thought it was funny. They thought it was humorous. It made them look big to be doing this. They were professionals at scourging. They took delight in it. And 2 soldiers would whip simultaneously. Sha, sha. One coming from this side, another coming from this side. So you come from this side, then you're getting it right back. Oh, you just constantly getting it from both sides. These ends were laced with rugged pieces of metal, wire, glass, and fragments of bone. And each of these leather straps would cause multiple lashes like a rake. Mine's all tangled up here. But the weight, just like you put a sinker on the end of a fishing line to give it some weight, well, you imagine the chips of bone, metal, glass that were in here giving it some weight. So when it made contact, it was not this right here that you see on these TV shows where you got a couple of little stripes here. No. It was multiple lashes. Okay? It had a short wooden handle about 18 to 24 inches long. And we said the mere anticipation of the first blow was arguably the worst, because one would stiffen up and their muscles would knot up in their stomach. Color would drain from their cheeks. Their lips would be drawn tight in anticipation of the first blow. And again, it would come across them like a rake. And these pieces of metal, glass, wire, and bone, they sank into the flesh. It wouldn't just superficially contact. It would sink into the flesh, just like a hook, just like a fishing hook would dig into your flesh. So that when they jerked back, pulling hard in order to tear whole pieces and chunks of human flesh from the body, shredding muscles, sinews, and they wouldn't even take time to untangle it. They'd come in right back with that same person's flesh still tangled in here. The tearing of the whip cut into the skeletal muscles, producing ribbons of bleeding flesh. The skin was shredded and it hung like ribbons of skin, like tinsel on a Christmas tree, if you will. It says at first contact, because of the weight on the end of it, at first contact, the thongs would bruise the skin. Okay? Remember in Isaiah 53:5? He was bruised for our iniquities. And then as it was jerked back, it would cut into the subcutaneous tissues, reaching the muscles and skeletal structure, He was wounded for our transgressions. But again, it was not limited to the back. It would extend to the buttocks, to the legs, wrap around into the stomach, the upper chest, and even the face would get it at times. This comes from those who witnessed it and recorded it, what a Roman scourging was like. Here are a couple of the historians that report to you what it was like. Historical records of the day describe one victim's back being so mutilated after a Roman scourging that his spine was actually exposed. Others recorded how the bowels of a victim spilled out through the open wounds created by the whip. Now just imagine that embarrassment. As the whip came across here, around here, and it pulled chunks of skin into the skeletal tissues, into the subcutaneous tissues, to where now that which was in your colon is starting to ooze out. How embarrassing is that? How embarrassing. How humiliating. How painful. Eusebius wrote this. It says, this was one of the historians and early writers, Eusebius. Eusebias. He wrote, the veins were laid bare. The very muscles, sinews, and bowels of a victim were laid open to exposure. If the scourging wasn't stopped, the slicing would eventually flay the victim's flesh completely off the body. With so many blood vessels sliced open by the whip, he would experience profuse blood loss and bodily fluids. His blood pressure would drop. Now, how many of you have ever had low blood pressure? And you know what it feels like. Can you imagine an excessive drop in blood pressure? Because of the massive loss of bodily fluids, his heart would pump harder and harder, trying to get blood to the necessary extremities. The blood loss would set the stage for hypovolemic shock and exhaustion asphyxia. He would experience excruciating thirst. That's why he asked for something to drink. Often fainting from the pain and eventually going into shock. One's heartbeat would become so irregular that he would often go into cardiac arrest. And Jesus had to stay 6 hours on a cross following this. Keep in mind, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Also a picture, if you will. This is something that's not often mentioned. A revelation that I was reminded of. What is attracted to an open wound? What is attracted? If you got an open cut, what's attracted to it? Flies. Exactly. Insects lighting on him. Burrowing into the wound. You can't swat it. You can't shoo it away. Because when you're being scourged, you're here. When you're on a cross, you're here. Isaiah 50 and verse 6, we read this in regards last week to the beard being plucked out. But it says, I gave my back. He didn't try to wiggle. He didn't try to avoid anything. He didn't try to flinch. He gave his back. Psalm 129 and verse 3, you have many of the psalmists, you have many of the prophets, like Isaiah in particular, who saw Jesus on the cross. They had prophetic revelation. They had a picture of what Jesus would look like, both being scourged and on the cross. The psalmist in Psalm 129 verse 3 says this, the plowers plowed my back. They lengthened their deep furrows. Picture, if you will, a harrow, a tiller, a harrow plowing a field and just laying back the ground. The ground may be hard, the ground could be soft, but when that harrow comes through with force, it just lays it back. That's what this thing did to the human flesh as it was being snatched back. This would bruise. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was wounded for our transgressions. And they kept doing it over and over, in excess of 39 times, because again, that was a Jewish law. The Romans had no such law, and they weren't going to give the Jews the satisfaction of obliging to their law. They were even more determined to go beyond that. We ain't listening to you. We're not going to go by your codes. Isaiah 52:14 says this: just as many were astonished, stunned, numb, devastated, appalled, is what that word means, so his appearance was marred more than any other man. Marred more than any other man. Now, it's interesting that that statement would be used, because we need to understand the culture of that day. The Romans adopted a lot from the Greeks, but then the Romans implemented some things of their own. Well, in that culture, they had sporting events that were different than ours. Yeah, they had races, because you heard Paul say, let us run the race that is set before us, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, they had races and Olympic style events, yeah, because you see all that in some of the statues. Okay, some of the, statues of throwing a discus or something. So they had that. But when it came to combat sports, they had boxing back then. We have boxing. But our boxing is with boxing gloves. They wore heavy gloves too, but it had serrated blades on their boxing gloves. And they had spikes in there with nails. And there were no rules. So when you hit, when you punched, you caused that opponent to bleed. There were some deep wounds inflicted on the opponent. Faces, ears, noses were permanently deformed because of the contact of the boxing gloves that they had back in those days. On top of that, they had wrestling. But wrestling wasn't like wrestling that we call it wrestling, It wasn't like wrestling of our day. All that fake stuff. In their wrestling, you could gouge eyes out. You could go for the private parts. You could, what you would deem as illegal now, where you would try to break somebody's back, lift them up, and bam. All that stuff in wrestling back in that day was legal. Often the winner would be beat up pretty good, the loser would be dead. And those who survived boxing matches, those who survived wrestling matches, they would have this best of the best competition. And it was called pancratia. And again, no part of the body was off limits. It was very vicious. You say, why bring this up? Can you imagine how disfigured? There are some statues, there are some pictures, or some paintings, if you will, of those, if you look it up, you'll see it, of those who were heavily involved in these combat sports, and how they were so deformed. Noses and everything in their face and stuff was so disfigured. And yet, Isaiah 52:14 says, Jesus was marred more than any other man. And they had witnessed these combat sports. And they said, Jesus looked worse than that. As far as the scourging is concerned, this is the significance. And now everybody needs to pay attention to it, but you in particular, because of your prayer request tonight. In 1 Peter 2:24, it said, by whose stripe we were healed. Isaiah 53:5, by his stripes we are healed. Okay? Isaiah 53:5, for by his stripes we are healed. 1 Peter 2:24, by whose stripe we are healed. You see the difference? I did to help emphasize it. What's the difference? But if you want to point out the difference that I was emphasizing is this. Is Isaiah is talking about by his stripes, well beyond 39, by his stripes, the wounding that took place as a result of those vicious stripes, by those stripes and the blood that was shed during the scourging, we have access to healing. And we can use Isaiah 53:5 as a base scripture to stand on and say, by your stripes I am healed. Now, Peter reiterates and quotes Isaiah 53:5, except he changes one word. And it says, by whose stripe we were healed. Is he referring to just one singular stroke? No. That word in the Greek is molops, M-O-L-O-P-S, and it refers to a full body stripe. Think, if you will, whereas Isaiah is talking about by his stripes, think, if you will, like a fine print marker doing a stripe versus these big bold markers that do a wide stripe. That's the best example I can come up with, sorry. Well, what Peter saw, because he is reporting what he observed with his own two eyes. And he's reporting that Jesus' back, that there was no skin on it, because his back looked like one solid, wide, broad, red stripe. And that's why he used the word molops to refer to a single stripe, whereas Isaiah referred to stripes, referring to the many stripes, however many it was. But Peter, and again, you got to understand, Peter previously had denied him prior to this. Afterwards, after the resurrection, he gets restored. So he's battling all this up here. Remember, it says he went out and wept bitterly after he denied him the third time? So he's feeling all kinds of guilt and shame here. And now he's got to observe what he's seeing here. Now that he's been restored, when he writes this epistle, he's remembering how he felt when he observed this horror. It says, molops refers to a full body stripe, a lashing that draws blood and produces discoloration and swelling of the entire body. As a result, you know when you have an injury, that there's swelling that comes in a matter of minutes. So now he's saying that in addition to the stripes, or what he described as a full, wide body stripe, now his body's starting to swell. We talked about how in the first 3 trials, they made sure this was messed up. Now, as a result of the scourging, from here on down, it's messed up. He was a bloody, deformed mess. Now, Peter's picturing all this. And that's why we said a few weeks ago when we observed communion here on Easter Sunday, do this in remembrance of me. Remembrance to them meant reenactment. So they're supposed to reenact and picture what they observed. Peter, no doubt, every time he took communion, he would close his eyes and he puts that morsel of bread in his mouth and he's thinking of his body that was broken for me. This I do in reenactment of what I saw. One full bloodied body stripe. Ribbons of skin hanging, tissues exposed, skeleton exposed, bowels cut open, sliced open, where everything's oozing out. And you wonder why he had difficulty carrying his cross. Then, as if that wasn't enough, Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 27. Look in verse 26. It says, Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. What comes next? Verse 27. So what happens in verse 27 through verse 31 follows this scourging. Does everybody see that clearly? It doesn't happen before, it happens afterwards. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus in the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort. A legion, 6,826 troops. A cohort is 1/10 of that, roughly 600. They take him into the praetorium and they stripped him. Okay? You notice what it says? They stripped him. Well, you can't strip clothes off if clothes hadn't been put on. So after this scourging, in which his back, his stomach, his legs, his buttocks, everything is bleeding profusely. After he's got ribbons of skin hanging, after he's got his, for lack of a better phrase, his meat, his flesh exposed, then apparently they put his clothes or a robe of some sort back on him. Can you imagine how blood red it was? How soaked in blood it was? How matted in blood it was? And yet it says they stripped it off of him. What flesh, what blood, what else came off when they stripped that robe off? And they put a scarlet robe on him, because here again they're going to mock him. Probably an old robe of Pilate's. They stripped him to expose his nakedness, because among the Israelites they honored the human body as being made in the likeness of God. So it was public humiliation to be exposed naked, whether on a cross or for a scourging. So Jesus was stripped naked for the scourging. He's stripped naked for what's about to happen, and he'll be stripped naked again on the cross. Exposed for all the world to see. But it says they put a scarlet robe on him. So once again, picture the bloodied matting of that robe just soaking up his blood. And it says, and after weaving a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they kneeled down before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. They weaved a plait of thorns. Now here again, this is a miniature version of it. And you can see how long even the miniature version of it is with these sharp thorns. And they put it on his head. And that ain't exactly comfortable here. Okay? And it says they plaited, which is impleco, which means they braided it or they intertwined it. Now in the region of Ein Gedi, Eingedi, there is what is called the Christ thorn jujube tree. And this is likely where they got these crown of thorns. I've seen pictures of it, of an actual tree in that region, in this Ein-Gedi region, and of this Christ thorn jujube tree. And the thorns are protruding just like this. They were long, razor-sharp, jagged, prickly thorns, and they were often dipped in poison. And they were pressed into his skull. Okay, you with me? Which would cause delirium. Because the word they use for put upon in Greek is epitithemi, which means they violently and forcefully jammed this crown of thorns upon his head, which would cause blood to just flow profusely from his brow. Then they put a reed in his hand. Now, a reed would grow nearby, one of those long, hard reeds. The best thing I can relate to you is like some sugar cane, something that's very hard. And they gave it to him as a staff because they're going to mock him as King of the Jews. They're going to mock him. It represents his authority because a king's scepter was his authority. Matthew 27 and verse 30, and they spat on him. Remember, they spat on him before when they plucked out the beard. Here they're spitting on him again. Now notice, when people say, okay, they spat on him, and then they move on. What does it say next? And they took the reed and began to beat him on the head. Did verse 30 come after verse 29? Yes. What happened in verse 29? They forcefully pressed this into his skull. Verse 30 says, they took the reed and they beat him on the head, hammering, 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 hammering this crown of thorns into his skull. Do you catch that? It's right there. And it said that they beat him on the head. Now that word beat we've used before. Whenever he was before at Caiaphas' house. It's the word tupto. If they were to use pio or patasso, it would have recurred to one hit. But because they used tupto, it means they were repeatedly beating him on the head with the reed. Hammering it, hammering it, hammering it. Now, in Mark 15, verses 17 through 19, it says they kept beating him, tupto. But when they do that, you know that he's going to fall over. How are you going to get beat on the head and stay standing? Even in John 19:3, it refers to this. So did he fall over when they hit him? Do you think the crown of thorns fell off? When they did, they reapplied it and they hammered it back in. As if the beating on the back and the chest and the legs and the buttocks wasn't enough. Matthew 27:31, and after they had mocked him, they took his robe off. Again, here comes the bloodied, blood-soaked garments, and they pull it off, taking skin, taking whatever else with it. And they put his garments back on him and led him away to be crucified. Now we get to the crucifixion. We won't get into the actual details of it. We probably will save that to next week. But we need to get into the prefacing of it and set the stage of it as a segue into next week. I need to get this off because that thing is sharp. Okay? Continue talking about the crucifixion. Where did it come about? Alexander the Great introduced it to Egypt and Carthage. Then the Romans learned it from them and they mastered it. Now Jesus goes to the cross because Philippians chapter 2 says, he became obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. Why does it use the word even? Emphasizing the fact that this is the worst form of death. There was nothing worse than a crucifixion. Those who knew they were going to be crucified, common criminals, they would often choose suicide before crucifixion. And many of them did. Whether they hung themselves, whatever they did to get a blade and slice their throat, I don't know. But many of them chose suicide to avoid the pain. Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 through 23 says this, for he that is hanged on a tree is accursed of God. And a crucifixion was reserved for the most serious crimes. Now, a crucifixion served a few purposes. Here's a secondary purpose that a crucifixion served. It was a sign to all those who were coming into town, a reminder to the citizens of Rome, it would be a reminder, not only there, but also even here in the region that Jesus walked. It was a reminder to them of what would happen if you dare participated in an insurrection. If you committed treason, if you bowed up against a government official, if you slice a government official's ear off, you could be subject to a crucifixion. Now, when you came in the road, you would already see the upright post, the stipes that's called. You would see them already in the ground along the road. And if they didn't have anybody hanging on it, at least the stipe was already in the ground. But if you had somebody hanging on it, then that was a sign that, hey, we better watch ourselves here. I mean, you think we slow down when we see a cop start beside the road because we're concerned about getting a ticket. No, that was a sign to them, hey, whatever we doing, whatever beef we got with the government, we better settle down because that could be us. But its primary purpose was this, and this is what people don't realize. One of the primary purposes of a crucifixion was to dismember the body. Dismember a body, such that when it's taking down off the cross, it would be limp, just like a skeleton is limp. Now, none of Jesus' bones were ever broken, but a Roman crucifixion did dismember the body. We'll get to that in just a moment. A victim was to carry his own cross. That was the intention. Now, what would happen is you would carry the patibulum, the crossbar. It would be across your shoulders like this. Until you were nailed to it when you got there, you would probably be tied to it. And you would carry the patibulum, the crossbar. You would not carry the entire cross. So these movies you see, where you see Jesus carrying the T-shaped cross, because the patibulum and the stipes together would have been over 300 pounds. You can't carry it. A victim was only responsible for carrying the patibulum that weighed between 75 and 125 pounds, dependent upon the size of the person. A little small person, they may have given them a small 75-pound patibulum. But for someone Jesus' physical stature, it probably was close to 125 pounds. The victim was usually naked the whole time. And then this Roman cohort we just spoke of, because it said in verse 27, they led him into Praetorium, and then it says in verse 31, they led him away to be crucified. And by nature of the word centurion, a centurion was head over 100 soldiers. And they would be carrying a sign called a titulus. And it would announce the crime of the particular person that's headed to the cross. Later, that titulus would be placed above the individual on the cross. Outside the city were the permanent stipes located. It was about a third of a mile journey, but mentioned the fact that he had suffered blood loss, obviously hypovolemic shock, and the fact you got to consider he hasn't slept in over 24 hours. Remember, he was up all day, up all night for the trials, and now he's up all day again. He's been up over 24 hours here. No doubt he stumbled repeatedly as that heavy patibulum was across his shoulders. Now keep in mind, it's called a what? An old rugged cross, right? Do you think they sanded that thing down nice and smooth? It's called an old rugged cross. What does his shoulders and back look like? And yet you've got the rugged cross on his shoulders, and it's heavy, rugged cross. the patibulum in and of itself. So no doubt he fell and stumbled on the way. To the point that there was an African man named Simon the Cyrene who was compelled to carry Jesus' cross. Compelled means he's forced into service. Why? Because of the man's size? Could be. Maybe the man was a big muscular fella and they said, "Here, you carry his cross." Luke 23:26 refers to Simon the Cyrene. 11 miles south is where he was from. He was no doubt in town for the Passover. Now, how would you like to be him? You're coming in town for the Passover. You're thinking about your Passover sacrifice, and you're walking and you see a victim going to the cross. And all of a sudden, one of these Roman soldiers, and not that you thinking you can take this Roman soldier because he's a centurion and he's got 600 guys behind him. And he says, "You carry this cross." Now, if you will, look in Luke chapter 23. We can get this much in tonight. Luke chapter 23, in verse 27. 27 through 31. I'll begin in verse 26 because that's a good starting point in the Bible here. "And when they led him away, they laid hold of one Simon of Cyrene coming in from the country and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus." So it says carry behind Jesus. So Jesus still has to stagger his way on up. "And there were following him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him." So these women, there were plenty of women who followed Jesus. Mary Magdalene was probably one of them. All these other Marys, Joanna, Susanna, all these other ladies that we've already spoken of. The ones who will later go and visit the tomb. They were probably crying and weeping. Why? Obviously they know he's about to die, but they're looking at the horror picture. The same one that they used to eat with. The same one who healed them. The same one who cast 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. Now he's a bloodied mess. Now keep in mind, there are no paved roads here. Jesus is weak. He fell frequently. That means dirt got into these open wounds. You got to picture this stuff. You got to get into the narrative. Now look in verse 28 what Jesus says. "But Jesus turning to them, he musters up enough strength to address them. And he says, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children.'" Remember, it was the children that they said, "Let his blood fall upon us and our children." He says, you better be praying for yourself and for your children. Verse 29, "For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." Verse 30, "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." That comes in the book of Revelation. You recall. "O mountains, fall upon us." He's already prophesying this. He says in verse 31, "For if they do these things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry, non-producing tree?" I am a green tree. I've been producing fruit for the kingdom. Many people have been healed, delivered, set free, raised from the dead. And if they will do this to me, a green tree, those who don't know me, you better be worried about yourself. He's saying, God's going to take care of me. You need to be concentrating on your own life and getting your life straight. Then it says in verse 32, "And 2 others also who were criminals were being led away to be put to death." And that's in fulfillment of a scripture that says, "And he was numbered with the transgressors." He was numbered with the transgressors. Now we have to address this next thing before we close tonight. What is the name of the place that they took him to be crucified? Golgotha. Do you know what it means? The place of the skull. Do you know why it's called the place of the skull?
There's mounds of skulls,
Okay.
stuff everywhere where people have been crucified before.
Okay. And that's no doubt true. That's probably true. But let me present something else to you that you may not have heard. Now, this comes from reliable early Christian writers. Jewish historians and early Christian writers and other reliable sources. Here's two of them that was what I'm about to say is coming from. Origen and Jerome. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Origen and Jerome. And they all confirm that Jesus was crucified just above where Adam was buried. Jewish tradition. Now, this is Jewish tradition. You don't necessarily see it here, per se, but it's Jewish tradition. Just like we have American history, this is their Jewish traditional history. It says that Shem, one of Noah's sons, buried Adam's skull, and it was believed that from that point forward, it was guarded by Melchizedek, and it's part of the Orthodox doctrine. Now, you remember there was an earthquake when Jesus dies. Fast forward a little bit, there's an earthquake. And the veil of the temple was rent. And what? The rocks and the ground began to split. I am told there's still a crack in the ground today at Golgotha. Now, symbolically at least, I'm not saying figuratively, I'm saying symbolically at least. If Jesus is indeed hanging on a cross directly above where Adam was buried, then his blood drips down, symbolizing the fact that the last Adam is covering for the sin of the first Adam. And that's why in many crucifixes you see a skull at the base of the cross. The last Adam's blood reached all the way down, figuratively speaking, signifying that he died for the whole human race. Amazing, is it not? I will mention this to punctuate it. When Jesus gets there, how do you think they hang him on the cross? Do you think they say, stand up straight, arms out wide? No. He gets thrown down on that hard clay, on that dirty ground, and his body is exposed. And all that dirt and all that clay gets mixed in with his blood. That's our Jesus. Jesus, for the joy set before him. We say he endured the cross. Now it's easy for us. What did we say at the very beginning of tonight? We said that we could take this as gnosis, doctrinal knowledge, and say, oh yeah, I believe it, that's part of our faith, and put it on the shelf. Or you can experience it and get epignosis, revelation of it. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. May we have epignosis revelation of what it took for Jesus to hang in there. So you got to understand what endured means. Endured in Greek is hupomeno. Hupo means under. Meno means stay, remain, abide. It was the word, again, that we've talked about before, was used to tell a Roman soldier, you man your post no matter what distractions come your way. No matter who tries to lure you away, you man your post, because that post is your responsibility. So you man it. Now that word hupomeno is translated endured, but it's also translated patience. So in patience, you stay put. And it says, for the joy set before him, Jesus hung in there. What did he say when he was arrested? Don't you know that I could call 12 legions of angels? Well, that doesn't mean that the only time he could have called them was prior to his arrest. He could have called them at any stage. When they gave him the first scourge, he could have called them. He didn't, for the joy set before him. When they put the crown of thorns on his head, he could have called them, for the joy set before him. When they make him carry that patibulum, he could have called them, but for the joy set before him. Why? Because by his scars and by his stripes, we are healed. If he would have skipped the scourging and gone straight to the cross, well, his blood would have been shed for our salvation. Yeah, because that was taken on the cross. He who knew no sin became sin on the cross. Not before, not after, but on the cross. So, what's the significance of the scourging? That was a doggone good question. And I said, I'm glad you asked. It's because in addition to salvation, he wants us to walk in health. And as we've noted before, it's going to be a crying shame when we get to heaven, that if the only generation that ever walked in divine health was the children of Israel for 40 years in a wilderness under an inferior covenant, who were mumbling, grumbling, and complaining and in rebellion. And yet we are under a better covenant. And we have these scriptures to stand on for our divine healing and health. And yet so many people don't. Why? Because they read Isaiah 53:5 and they read 1 Peter 2:24 and they hear it as gnosis, as a doctrinal position, and they put it on a shelf. Instead of receiving it as epignosis, experiential contact knowledge. So once you've had epignosis, that by his stripes you're healed, and you witness God healing you and raising you up, then anybody who wants to say, well, I don't believe in healing for today. That passed away. That passed away with Jesus and the apostles. You can say, you can debate that all you want. It's going in one ear and out the other. Because all I know, just like the blind man in John chapter 9, they come to him and they kept asking him. He says, how many times I got to tell you, I once was blind, but now I see. I once was sick, but now I'm healed. I could say the same thing that back in 2003, when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. I don't know how many of y'all remember that. I don't know if y'all knew that. But I was diagnosed with it. I was in a hospital in Walterboro. And they had me look out the window and said, hey, because they thought I was a resident of Walterboro. They said, you can go ahead and go across the street and file for your disability because you'll never work again. I said, I don't receive that report. And I walked out of that hospital and God healed me, and I've never had any issues since. So people want to say he doesn't heal. I say, no. You can gnosis all that all you want to and debate it. I have epignosis that he does indeed heal. You have epignosis that he does heal because you've prayed for relatives and you've seen them healed. So people can sit there and argue all they want, and you can say, I know. I once was blind, but now I see. I once was sick, but now I'm healed. And that's what it's all about. It's all about reading what's available to us and claiming it for our own lives. That's it in a nutshell. That's the life of a believer. Receiving of his finished work. Is he still getting scourged? No, it's finished. Is he still hanging on a cross? No, it is finished. So just receive it. Amen?